Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Jonah from Discover, and today we are talking to Jessica Baum. It is going to be a wonderful conversation. We're diving into some very real life stuff about how to detox from an unhealthy relationship. But gonna do my little spiel before we get into all the meaty real life stuff. First, hop in the comments. Let us know if you can hear us and you can see us all right. Where you're tuning in from, maybe how you heard about Jessica or you heard about Discover. Also, especially for this event, feel free to pop any questions or comments or experiences you've had into the chat and the comments. We love seeing that, and we're going to be answering those questions and sharing those experiences as we go. And if we're moving fast or you have to get up from the computer for a second, don't fret. All of this will be available at a replay. It'll be emailed to you, and it will also be on this YouTube page and on the Discover event page. Formally, just want to say hi, Jessica. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, super excited. And so, like I was saying, we're going to be talking about how to detox from an unhealthy relationship. We're going to go over some reasons why it's so hard to move on and how to really let go in your process of grief. And we're going to explain kind of trauma bonding and breaking patterns so you can create healthier relationships. A little background on Jessica. Jessica is a psychotherapist and coach, the owner and founder of Relationship Institute of Palm Beach, as well as Be Self Full online coaching company. She has an undergraduate degree from Fordham University and holds a master's degree in mental health and counseling from South University. As a certified substance abuse specialist, her focus is chemical abuse, codependency, and anxiety. Jessica is also a certified imago therapist. Sorry if I said that wrong.
You got it.
And couples counseling. And using the Imago approach, Jessica helps treat family systems and couples issues with an extensive knowledge on relationships and trauma. Jessica, I'm really excited about this event, especially after this whole last year. Mental health and well being and relationships became, they were important to me before, but learning how to actually consciously manage them has been a big passion of mine, both and just absorbing all of that content. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to you just to introduce yourself and we can get into it.
Yes, like as you said, Jessica Baum, psychotherapist, and I specialize in a lot of relational issues. And I just want to piggyback. It's been a challenging year. And I think relationships have either broken or gotten stronger. And it's definitely tested us all. And whether we got conscious and underneath what's going on, or we decided after this year it was too much, it might be time to move on. I felt passionately about helping people really navigate that, because it can be murky waters, depending on the relationship. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Did you want to hop in? I know you had a couple slides here that we can look at and then also just have a conversation around it. I would love to know a little, just if you can give us an overview of kind of what you're teaching us today.
So today I really want to, and if you're showing up today and watching, I'm sure that you're going through something. So I just really want to point out what the challenges are, because it is really difficult to leave certain relationships. There are particular relationships that can pull us in, or we can be confused even when the logical part of us knows that the right thing to do is to leave. There's emotional layers and trauma bonding and deep attachment issues that kind of happen for people that can keep us stuck in a lot of patterns. And so really what I want to do is kind of educate people for what to look out for so that they can get to the other side. So this is for people who really want to leave, but really get confused or cycle back in, or don't really understand what's going on inside their body, because there's a lot of chemical responses too. So this course is really, it's like a compassionate, or what I'm teaching you is like a compassionate way to look at what you're going through physically, spiritually, and emotionally as you actually separate from someone you're attached to. And it's really funny because I get so many clients saying, well, it was an unhealthy relationship, I should just leave. Why is it so hard? Or why do I miss them? And I think when it comes to grief, and we'll talk more about this, like loss is loss. And if you're attached
Mm.
to someone that you perceive as unhealthy, you're still going to feel loss of that relationship. And it's a big misconception that you're not going to feel that loss when you leave, even what you feel is an unhealthy relationship.
I, I I feel, if I may, like I've had the experience in the past too of, and maybe because it was hard for friends to witness me being in a toxic relationship, or they had been telling me for years it was about time. But there's also like, it can be hard when you're grieving and the people around you are also kind of celebrating, or
Yeah.
it feels like that might be coming, like, oh, everyone's going to be relieved, or the shame cycle of like, oh, I didn't do it, or all is my community going to be disappointed again. I
Right.
know
And
I've
that's such an important factor. Like, so mostly we vent to our community about the bad things in a relationship, and everybody's rooting
Mhm.
for us to leave. And
Mhm.
then when we can't pull the trigger, so to speak, people can get annoyed or frustrated or disappointed. And the truth is, when you're in the relationship, it's a lot harder to sometimes leave. And there are a lot more barriers to leaving than people even imagine unless you're in the situation yourself.
Right.
Um,
And so, just to be clear, kind of from where we're going from here, are we talking today about how to get to that point where you know you want to leave the relationship? Or are we talking about once you know, but it's still, it can be, I have friends who have told me they need a breakup and 2 years later they finally do it. So I know it's a long road.
I think like psychically, sometimes you can know, but you don't have all the tools and the
Mm,
support. Like, I think most importantly, it's about getting the support, creating the insight of what you might walk through so that you can leave. And some people are leaving even before they have left, in terms of their psyche starting to wrap their head around what the next chapter looks
mm,
like. And that's where people can get stuck in fear. But I think leaving a relationship happens a long time before you actually leave the relationship. Like you said, some people can think about it
mm,
for 2 years before they have the support and the tools to really make the change that they want to make. And so this I'm speaking to people who know in their heart they want to leave,
mm.
but there's so much fear or trauma bonding, or what that next step will look like, or the unknown, that keeps them blocked from kind of moving forward to what their heart or their mind knows they need to do.
Right. Well, and even so, some of the language you're using and things are familiar to me now after this last year. Also, because there's a lot of there's I feel very lucky to live in a time where there's people like you and a lot of resources that even are giving us the language to talk about these things. But can we get into a little bit some of this language, because it may or may not be familiar to everyone.
Sure. Yeah,
So,
sure. And yeah, I put the slide here because it is so normal when you're deeply attached to someone and you leave to have symptoms, because our body can go through withdrawal. And relationships, they give us oxytocin and adrenaline and dopamine. Even the toxic ones, they're like roller coasters. And without that person there, good, bad, or indifferent, our body can go through a lot of physical symptoms. And I think it can cause us to either want to go back or freaked out. We might be
mm,
in the unknown. And the truth is, people have chemical reactions to us. So when we take them away, we are going to also have symptoms in our body that might feel really scary. And so here's just a list of some of them. And I think the most important thing is, like, this is just transitionary. These will not
mm,
stay. If you have the right support, and I'm not just talking about my course, like, you really need to lean on friends and family. That's probably like the most community. When you're in a toxic relationship, 9 times out of 10, there's an isolation factor there. And that when you do leave, surrounding yourself with support, even if you have to isolate a little around that support, but knowing that your support's there, and knowing that your body might go through a lot of symptoms. And it's
mm.
normal. I want to normalize that a little so that people don't get freaked out and go backwards. And we'll talk a little bit about like the relapse factors, but I just it's amazing what our body goes through when we're kind of leaving something that is perceived as unhealthy or healthy or toxic, so to speak.
So is
Um,
this, do you consider just like for me, this seems already like very much a tool when you're going through this process is just to know if you're feeling these things. It's not that those feelings aren't real, but it's worth sitting down and being like, this might be temporary. I'm not, this is part of the transition and not what life is going to be like now that I'm not with this person.
Yeah, I kind of think of
Right.
it as like sometimes when you're really angry or you know you want to leave and you leave maybe for logical reasons, the attachment gets pulled and there's
Mm,
anxiety that comes up because we are attached to each other. We're in like a relational energy. And it can feel, at least this is my experience and clients' experience, like the rug has been completely pulled out underneath you because you've been
mm,
attached to that person. So now you have to like kind of go back into your body and feel everything and feel what it's like to not be attached. Like people genuinely think it will be easy on the other side, and the truth is it's going to bring up anxiety and loss, and it could feel like you're free falling a little bit in the beginning.
mm. Yeah,
So
it's so valuable even just to have some semblance of like, uh, these are common things to feel. You're not, heartbreak
you're
can
not
feel,
crazy.
yeah, yeah. Heartbreak can feel so personal. It's hard sometimes to remember that other people go through this. Anyone you know who's been in love has gone through these, even out of good relationships where it wasn't toxic too, that just separation from someone is a process. It's not like one day you're just out, oh, now I'm me again, and it's all good.
Totally. And everybody's different. And I can speak for myself and a lot of the people that I work with. It's layers upon layers upon
Mhm,
layers. And you can get through a layer and be feeling good. And then a song can come on or something else can come on and it can trigger
mhm,
another. It's actually like activating another layer of grief, which isn't a bad thing. It's just kind of
mhm,
important to know like it's a process. You're like basically walking in the dark a little bit through the process till you get to the other side. So having the right support in friendships and connections and having the tools and the awareness that it is many layers.
mhm. Alright, well, let's just,
Yeah,
I already, I appreciate so much even that you start off talking about this as a process of grief, because I kind of like I was mentioning, I think it's so easy to think of breaking up as just, oh, it's finally over, and it doesn't get the same attention as losing someone if someone dies or something, but you don't always lose that person in your life, but you lose that connection the way it was, right?
absolutely. And that's like a really, really important point that you bring up. And so I do look at it as grief, whether you're getting broken up with or you're deciding to leave. Sometimes this is also for people who are getting broken up with. When someone
Mm,
dies or
mhm,
passes, there's a part of our psyche that if it's an elderly person that is already preparing ourselves for this grief. And it therefore is sometimes less complicated. But when you're leaving a relationship or when a relationship leaves you, like someone decides to leave you, it gets a lot more complicated because that person is still here on the earth. So,
right.
the reasons as to why they leave you or you choose to leave can vacillate. One day you could be really clear on why you want to leave. And then a lot of like loneliness or sadness or remembering the good times can creep back up to the surface, and so it's layers, and because they're still alive it makes it even more complicated. And I think
Mhm,
how you're either broken up with or how you or and why you choose to leave can make it also really complicated. You might not get answers that you want from the other person. And I'm speaking specifically to people who got broken up with. I think that can really lead to a lot of complications as well because you want this resolution and it might have brought up some abandonment issues and it might not make sense to you and you might not get those answers, but you still want to honor your grief process and have the tools to move forward to not stay stuck on that person and the why for so long.
mhm. I
Um, Go ahead.
Yeah, no, please. Oh, just in my experience, that's been probably the hardest long-term effect of a difficult breakup is the unanswered questions. And then also, though, in the process, sometimes of there have been times where years later, I still have enough of a connection with a person to reach out and maybe try and get an answer. Or it happens early on in the breakup, but I'm curious your advice on this because I've very much come to a mentality in those situations of being careful about the questions I ask and making sure I want the answers before I ask them.
Right.
Because sometimes the answers weren't better than not knowing. Not
That's
to
true.
get specific, but
And
and not to say you shouldn't, but like coming to peace with like being coming to peace with what it was and not finding closure through other means, not through hacking at every little continuing question that comes up now that it's not. If that makes sense?
yeah, no, it is. And if you are getting feedback, it can be helpful. But also, I think that a lot of people break up and they don't really understand. So they'll
Mm,
blame or they'll point out something in the relationship that doesn't work. But 9 times out of 10, it's a disconnect that keeps happening in the relationship. And there are lots of what we call ruptures in my world with no
hmm,
repair. And there's no emotional or empathic repair in the relationships. The relationship doesn't get closer, it just keeps rupturing and leads to kind of like a roller coaster or a cycle. And so we can point out, like, you don't take me on enough dates, or you don't spend enough time with me. And when you really get to
sure.
the underneath all of that, it's usually around like the quality of the connection, the conflict, and the ability to come to repair and build deeper intimacy. And if you don't have that, the relationship might end for so many reasons, but typically it's because you don't have the formula. You're not conscious of the formula.
Poof.
Yeah.
Yeah. um,
Yeah.
yeah, that hits. Um, would you? But just because I want to address this, kind of, you've put grief in three different categories
I
relative to
did.
relationship, and would
I did.
you walk us through a little bit what that thinking is and how these different griefs affect us or how they're relevant?
Yes. Regular grief is kind of like, when your grandma's getting older and it's super sad. But your psyche's already preparing for that, before it happens. So it doesn't happen out of nowhere. It's not a shock. Complicated grief is a little bit what I was explaining before, and that might come out of nowhere, and or it's the type of grief where like a logical part of you knows that you need to leave, but the emotional part and the
Hmm.
layers stay stuck, so it becomes complicated, or you get left and you don't have those answers, so you can stay in a complicated process for a while because the wounded part of you wants to heal with that person and that person isn't available. So the abandonment wound gets kind of recreated in complicated grief, and people get stuck for a really long time and they hand their power away. So I see that happen a lot, particularly with people who are struggling in a more addictive type of relationship. And then accumulated grief is is grief that's built up. So sometimes when we're leaving a relationship, we can grieve because of that, but the feeling of loss is something we are so familiar with. And so a lot of the loss in our life can come up with the loss of something. One relationship, we can feel like a big well of pain of the many times we've kind of gotten attached to other people, and now we're leaving this one, but all of that pain kind of rises to the surface, which can be very challenging as well if you don't have the right
Hmm.
support. So it can be familiar, like loss becomes familiar, and so we try to avoid it, or it feels overwhelming because maybe it brings up past loss. It can also be a beautiful catalyst if you choose to look at it that way. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
so that's I'm sure, and I'm sure people who are listening, if you can think of your life, I'm sure there have been times when you've had regular grief. Like I had my grandmother die And it was incredibly sad. She was like a second mother to me. But I also, there was a part of me, she was 95, that knew that this was coming. So even though I grieved and I'm sad, it wasn't complicated, or a dog passing at an old age. But complicated grief is really it's just a stuck point. Like your psyche is battling with trying to understand the why, so you can stay stuck for a while in it. So
Mm.
that's really the main difference. And the accumulated grief is just the feelings that come up aren't always related to the event happening in the here and now. It's like past trauma and past losses come to the surface when you're losing someone new, or just losing someone in general.
Yeah. Well, and Twin Flames is commenting, it depends upon the nature of the relationships for sure. And yeah, it, I, when you were saying that, just and I'm curious your experience as well, but I've felt maybe less so regular grief, but even in the way of like knowing a relationship was maybe bound to come to an end. I feel like I've had a nice soup of all of these at some point within one breakup before.
Oh, okay.
And it just in like because sometimes the emotional process takes a long time. And so and
Mhm, mhm.
maybe I don't know if maybe I'm misplacing these, but for me
No,
it's like the regular, the regular grief, I knew it was coming. The complicated grief, we're in the midst of it. The accumulated grief, it's over, but every breakup brings the hurt of past breakups too. Or
for sure.
or yeah. Or we
I
get
put
better at it, I don't know.
yeah, and I like what Twin Flame says. It depends on the nature of the relationship. And I don't know if anybody who's watching is familiar with attachment theory, but it also depends on the type of attachment that you have made with this person. So
Mm,
I find that when people date someone who can compartmentalize and or discard is something, and you're on the receiving end of that, that can be really traumatizing in itself. And I talk a lot about like attachment
mm,
theory in the work that I do, and the type of attachment you form with that person and how it ends can be traumatic within itself. So yeah, the anxious avoidant dance is what I do a lot of work around. And some people can compartmentalize better than others. Although I don't know that they're carpental, they're doing that for the moment. I think their grief comes later. And then some people
mm.
feel the grief all at once and in the moment, and knowing, which type you are. And then sometimes it waxes and wanes. But I think a lot of people who would be interested in something like this probably suffer in the moment when the attachment is severed a little bit more often than the type that compartmentalizes a little easier.
Mm,
Oh
and
yeah,
do you what was that?
I was just reading a comment. Go ahead.
And yeah, that just I appreciate Twin Flames. I appreciate you being here. Yep. We're it's this stuff is very relevant in many ways in our lives. But do you have any tips? Because it helps, I know, to start breaking down the like symptoms and these kinds of grief. Do you have tips for kind of recognizing which place you're in if at the moment it isn't obvious?
I think when your logical side is like, I can't stay in this relationship anymore, but then I call it your emotional side, but your younger self or your more emotionally attached side has a loneliness or a conflict, and so you can't make a decision and you're trapped. That would say that you're more not in complicated grief, but you're in a complicated process of getting to the right solution, and that the grief will probably be complicated as well, because the two parts
Mm,
of yourself haven't come to terms with like self-soothing and dealing with what's going on inside. So you're going to vacillate a little when you leave. And so that's when it's important to kind of keep the logical side. If you truly know that this is not the relationship for you, keep the logic. I call it a logic list. It's one of the things in the course, but keep the logic in the forefront, because your emotional side is going to go through these stages, and you just don't want to kind of reach out to the wrong people. You want to reach out to safe support. So that's
mm,
one of the ways. And if it's accumulated, if you've had a lot of grief in your life or loss, you could be like postponing this because there is a lot of feelings that are going to come up, and your psyche actually knows that. And your psyche will be knows when it feels safe. So if you have the right support, as in the right people and the right plan, and you feel safe, you're more likely to walk away from a toxic relationship. If you don't have that support in place, it's a very scary place to step into. So, more than the
Yeah.
course itself, like setting up a support system is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, well, in using that support system too, I know out of my last really rough breakup was just coming out of it. It took a few months to remember how many friends I had if I just reached out to them.
Yeah, and
Because I
it's
definitely,
great.
yeah.
They all come back to the surface when you're ready,
Yeah.
right? Like they're there for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also that there can be a sense of pride too. I was definitely in a place of like, I can do this on my own. I have the tools. I'm a smart person. And then yes, I did, but it got a lot easier when I let other people in and let them love me and help me, and also just to hear their experiences and share.
I think
But,
that's like the fact that you're saying that as a man is so important because as a psychotherapist, we know that healing happens in relationships, and that healing or transitioning from one place to another happens when we have people to lean on, and having that community makes all the difference. And I think male or female, but men tend to think they can do it on their own. But I think we also live in a society that promotes independence and self-sufficiency, and the truth is we are independent, interdependent, and we need each other, we need community. And when we're in a toxic relationship, we usually isolate from that community because we're stuck in the drama of the
mhm,
relationship. So if you are hearing this, and you are scared about transitioning, like reach out to safe people and start letting people who are truly safe, warm, receptive, non-judgmental people know that you're about to go through a transition, and you'd be surprised who shows up for you. It's pretty amazing because people do show up.
mhm. Yeah, it's also rewarding once you enter that cycle. Just to it is cyclical because then they love you, you love better, and it's yeah. I I also the role that gratitude has played in my breakups from that cycle, because everything can feel so lost, and then as you just have an interaction where even if it's a coworker you open up to that is a safe person, but you didn't want to talk about that with them until they invited you to, but then when you get that love back, it's then you love better and vice versa.
Totally.
So
And you shouldn't
that's
have to
my
go through
experience
this
at least.
alone. You shouldn't not have to go through this alone. Like
Yeah.
it's not something you might want to isolate in it, but you shouldn't
Right.
feel alone in it.
Right. Yeah. Well, and before we move on, I just wanted to appreciate Catherine for sharing too. I very much relate to this. Sometimes it's grief related to the missing out of the life you thought you'd have for yourself or your kids, and not so much missing the toxic ex or attachment. And Catherine, you were just saying, at least that was the case for me, and I just wanted to say I can totally relate to that. In one of my past relationships, I got very attached to just what our life was going to be, regardless of the person.
You
And it was hard to separate that. It's really hard.
it's beautiful that she said that. And one of the exercises in the course that I didn't talk about in this lecture, but I'll say it for those who are watching, is that I have people write 3 letters, and they're
Mm,
goodbye letters. And one goodbye letter to all the bad times, one goodbye letters to all the
mm,
good times, and then one goodbye letter to all the possibilities. And when I do this with my clients in person, the goodbye to the possibilities and the dreams is what everyone cries around,
mm,
and it's what we are attached to. And once we realize that that's not actually the reality, we can start to see that we're attached to the dream that actually isn't real, and we can start to kind of cope with letting go of the dream that doesn't exist, which is still the loss. it's still a loss. It's what we made up in our head a little bit, like what our life was going to be mapped out like. So that,
Yeah.
that's an important part of the grief process, and it actually helps put the perspective on what we're really grieving.
Yeah. That's been hard for me too, though, because I know that's where I've had to battle shame coming in. Because then, not the only place, but but one of the places where it can bring up a lot of questions, like how much of my love was for this person and how much was for this world building we were building. Were we building it? What were they doing? It's hard to live in that space.
Yeah,
um yeah.
I think that's, we're missing the possibilities, but I think in all relationships, you're co-creating a future together.
Mhm.
That's part of the energy of the relationship. So it is actually very real that it is the
Mm,
possibilities that you might not be living in the moment because the relationship isn't what you thought, but you in some ways are psychically co-creating a future together too, which is the hardest part, and so I don't know. Yeah, the shame piece, maybe you feel bad that you're letting go of that or that you created something that's not real. But I think there's some realness to the co-creation of what the future looks like for two people with the best intentions in the beginning.
I appreciate that perspective. Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
um just because each one of these slides, I'm sure we could go very deeply in, but I want to make sure just in this presentation we get to what you wanted to offer. And will you talk a little bit? So the loopholes for relapse. So this is when you've ended it, but it's easy to try and fall back into it, or it's. Can you
Yeah.
explain this a little bit?
So, the course talks about the 7 layers of grief. The truth is, there's 5 traditional layers of grief. And when you're grieving, it's normal to go through denial, which we won't cover too much of, bartering, anger, and depression, and then acceptance. And then I've added some other layers in there because when you're grieving someone who's still alive, where you still have the option of going back, there's always a possibility of relapse. And depending on where you are in the process, like anger, it's pretty easy to walk away when we're in anger. And
Hmm.
then when we slip into the depression, it's pretty easy to go back. And so everybody some people put anger before depression, depression before anger. I think traditionally it's anger before depression, but I think depending on who you are, you go through it in your own way and you can vacillate between the two. So one of the loopholes is knowing that when you're in the depression, what's coming up for you? Is there abandonment, sadness, loneliness, like it has that existed in you before, and working with that part of you so that you don't kind of go back to the one quote unquote fix at this point, because
Hmm.
remember we're trying to leave this relationship. So working with that part of you and kind of honoring that loneliness might have existed in you before this relationship, and maybe they were a cure at one point to that, but they no
Mm,
longer are. But our psyche can kind of trick us into thinking they still are the cure. When we're in that much pain, we'll do a lot of things to get out of the pain. So knowing the stages of the relapse is kind of knowing when you're going to hit the depression or when the depression's going up, having the tools and the insight and working with those parts of yourself. And then I wrote attachment and its layers. And trauma bonding, which I could talk about a lot. But I think the next slide is around loneliness. And I'm going to say that a lot of people who struggle with leaving, yeah, that loneliness is probably the number one thing that I hear, and a disconnect from themselves and a grief. And sometimes that is a trauma. Like you might have felt
mm,
lonely in your childhood, or you might have gone through a period in your life where you're lonely. And now when you're connected with someone and that person's no longer with you, all of your experiences of loneliness might float to the surface again. And so you're very vulnerable in those moments if you don't have the right support and tools. And that's when people cycle a lot in these relationships and they become more turbulent. So it's really important to know what's ahead of you so you can kind of plan and be ready. so you can have this break and really get your life back. And I talk about
Mm.
trauma bonding in the course, and that, that's a topic all in itself, but the course has a formula to figure out what your trauma bond is, because we all have core wounds and we'll play those core wounds out in all of our relationships. And so
Mm.
understanding where your wound is and what your wound is and healing that and working towards healing that or being aware of it will help you not repeat it in the next relationship, because sometimes the answer isn't always a new relationship if you're carrying these
Right.
patterns around with you.
Right. Yeah. It's it's been a process for me in my life to and I didn't do a good job when I was younger. Um, but as I've gotten older, I think I've gotten better at in a new relationship recognizing what is what I'm bringing to this, what I'm excited about and bringing to this new relationship that has to do with this other person, and what I'm excited or bringing to this relationship that just has to do with me as I am in relationships.
That that's an important distinction to make for sure. So how
Yeah.
much excitement is from them and how much is coming genuinely just from you.
Well, excitement, and also I say excitement, but also bad stuff too, jealousy, or all these things that have nothing to do with recognizing what is part of what these me and this new person are building, and what is I don't like the word baggage because it sounds like you're carrying it around your whole life,
Embedded
but in the
patterns, core beliefs,
I like
insecurities.
that better. Yes, I like all of that better.
Yeah, they live
Yeah.
inside of us, and you know, they'll get repeated, but in the right relationship, they have the opportunity to heal. So it's not
Mhm.
in the right relationship with ourselves, with the right relationship with a therapist and friends, and in your romantic relationship. If you pick someone who's more secure or can work through conflict with you, you can heal a lot of those things if you're more conscious of them. Sometimes people leave a lot of relationships, but they're not conscious of what their trauma bond is. And sometimes they'll replay it in their next relationship. So I do a lot around helping you navigate the root of it, because when you understand the root of that pattern, you're less likely to, I don't want to use the word manifest, but recreate that pattern out of fear in your next relationship.
Hmm. Yeah. It for me, it continues to just come back to, in my experience, that if I didn't have the community and the good people I had around me as a reflection, like as I'm thinking back on my own experiences, and in many ways very proud of where I am versus who I was 10 years ago,
Right.
uh, it was my community that reflected those things and gave me those tools to actually make the change and not just go bringing the same thing to relationship, regardless of who the other person is in the relationship.
And the
Yep.
caveat I would say is all those things that you bring into relationship, they're not necessarily bad. I wouldn't label them or judge them. They're there as protectors for you.
Mm.
Right. And so this goes back to your trauma bonding kind of scenario, if you can identify your core wound. But even if it's jealousy or whatever, they're protecting you from what you fear most. So they're there
Mhm.
for good reason. And when you start to understand why they're there and how they developed, you befriend them rather than hate them. And when you can talk about them with your partner, you can really even heal. And we're digressing into therapy, couples
Right.
therapy, but in healing relationships, your trauma can get healed by talking about them and being conscious of them and being more aware of them. In a toxic relationship, they actually get used against you, and the fear
Mm.
keeps you gridlocked a lot of the time. And loneliness, fear of
Mm.
financial or what you're going to do next. Sometimes I used to tell clients, when you leave a relationship, if you met them at 15 or 19 or 22, you have to revisit that part of you. You're going to pick up parts of your singleness that you might have forgotten about, because that part of you is there too. So you're revisiting older part or younger parts of you when you're starting the next chapter as well. So it's a lot.
Yeah, it's and then it's a lot to also just have to do amidst the lives that we all have because I don't know, we're getting better. It seems I'm an optimist kind of by default, but like it seems like just conversations like you and I having this conversation, it's becoming more common and stuff, but it's also it's hard and maybe especially for men or people in living within a construct, whatever it is that makes them feel they have to act a certain way to have that space. Or even like when you say when you have a partner you can talk about these things with, it took me a long time to have that partner and it ended up being someone I knew for a really really long time already, so it's it's it I guess I'm just expressing empathy for the journey, and I don't I don't believe anyone can get it right off the bat, which you weren't saying. I think it's very
Yeah, we don't
I
get it right.
appreciate yeah. I also just I appreciate you giving giving credit to the to those things being valuable and being able to start loving them and
Mhm.
relate to them and not just not think
Yeah.
you have to ditch them, but
Even my anxiety, because I openly share that I have a lot of anxiety at times. Like my anxiety is a protector. Your fear that you have around leaving this relationship is protecting you from probably feeling abandonment, or they're all protectors at the end of the day. They're just not always working for you. So,
right.
by befriending them and understanding why, like sometimes they soften, and you'll see that with
Mhm.
healing. They don't ever, or you can give them a new job or redirect them, but they don't necessarily need to go away. They just kind of need to be redirected.
Mhm.
Um,
I love it. Sorry, Dad. I want to just call out quick. Ingrid is saying that's why Adele's new song gets me.
I don't know it.
It's really beautiful. Just very relevant to what we're talking about, but also so is music and art as a power. But sorry,
Yeah, no, that's cool. I'm
I
gonna
could
listen
talk
to
about
that.
yeah. Just I want to respect your time and everything, and I really could talk about all of these things forever because they just I think it's how we grow and it's how we open. And already you've given me more than a few things to think about, and as I continue to process relationships that are long over, but continue to want to get more familiar with a better version of how I sit with them in my everyday life. But let's talk a little bit why you made this course and what was the driving force behind putting this in a like course format, and because it's a different kind of accessibility than other things. But what
Right.
drove you to do this?
Well, personally, I've been through my own experiences, and there was nothing out there that really explained to me the process, which I wish I would have known at different times in my life ahead of time.
Mm,
Like what my body would go through, what my mind would go through, where I'd get stuck, where my trauma bonding was getting replayed. So I was like, okay, not everyone can go out and get a therapist and afford a therapist and walk through this. We can have friends and we can have family, but like people need this information and they need these tools to move forward. And so I thought, well, how do I make this more accessible to the everyday man and woman who maybe aren't seeing a therapist weekly, but have the support system in place and want to find out what their trauma bonding is and want to work through exercises to let go of a relationship or understand what's going on inside their body. I wanted to give that because I don't think I had that at one point in my life. And I just thought it was
mm,
important to share that from a therapeutic end because I've helped so many people transition. And I think it's a complicated process and it's not as easy as maybe what your friends or other people are saying. Oh, like it seems logical on the outside, but inside there's so many layers and stages and twists and turns and insecurities and fears that come up. So I just wanted to provide like basic a roadmap for people to get to the other side.
mm-hmm. And uh So just we can go over, I know we've talked a lot about like what is in this course, but
Mhm.
can you just give a little overview of like the course itself? Because we've touched on a couple things, but just as a comprehensive, like front to back.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of exercises in the course, but basically I go through like if you're leaving a narcissistic or a trauma bonding or one of those relationships that are just really hard to get out of and you really want to know what the stages are, I go through that from that lens. So
Mm,
why would denial be a little bit harder? Why was bartering a little bit harder? And a lot of what we covered today, but a lot more exercises and video content, and I really guide you into your trauma bond. So the goal is to create insight, to activate healing, and so that you don't repeat the same pattern again. And also, like, what to expect, which is a lot of what we covered today, but more of what to expect. And there's a couple exercises. One of them where the goodbye letters came up in our talk today, but there's a couple more really profound exercises that help you kind of move through grief so you don't stay stuck in that process as well.
mm. I appreciate that. Well, for everyone watching, you can get Jessica's course. The link is in the comments. It's also in the description of the video, and it'll be emailed to you along with the replay. Uh, Jessica, I appreciate you so much. If anyone has any questions, please pop them into the comments. I did want to ask you a little more uh, personal question, just in the sense of in my life, and especially in this last year, there's been a lot of conversation about just and my community, a lot of conversation about what it is to be a man and to for a man to grow in emotional capability and the just what to redefining maybe what it means to be a man in a relationship or what spaces are there.
You know,
And
go ahead.
oh, just the question I've had, because my experience has been when I consistently the
Mhm.
more, and I'm working within, some stereotypes here, so I know there's a wide spectrum, but my experience is most often when I do take the time to be vulnerable and communicate with the women around me, they're very receptive to it. But do you have some advice, whether it's specific phrases or resources, for how to break into that process of being vulnerable? It sounds silly maybe, but like
Yes, I
how do
love
you
that
get
you're
better
asking.
at being vulnerable?
And it is a stereotype, but I do a lot of couples counseling, and 70% of the time, the male has a harder time stepping into vulnerability than the woman, and there are complications on both ends, but I would say that when you are vulnerable, you build connection. And so the
Mm,
reward when you're vulnerable with the right people is that you feel more connected to after. But the knee jerk to be vulnerable for you might never be your first, let me jump in, because at some point it was scary for you, or you shut it down, or you learned that it wasn't okay. And, many men are taught to be tough and, stuff their feelings and this, that. So you might never lean in and be vulnerable right away. And so it's like, why would I put my hand on a hot fire? Like, if I learned early on that that wasn't a safe thing to do, and there might be part of your childhood where you learned to not be vulnerable, you could revisit that with a therapist. But the caveat is, I'd say, like, when you can do the opposite of what your body wants to do, which is probably to run in the other direction, but be brave enough with the right people. And I think that's
mm,
the key. Like, the more you can be vulnerable with someone who can hold the space and like connect with you and share with you, the more you reinforce the pattern to be vulnerable. So I think it's about being vulnerable with safe people, and men more than ever need to step into that realm, and it's really ingrained for you guys to do the opposite. I don't have as hard time as being vulnerable, but sometimes I have a harder time like containing and letting the other person be more vulnerable. I mean, I'm a therapist. I do that in my day to day, but vulnerability is something I'm good at, which is I think why people are drawn. But I would say in couples counseling, when either side can get vulnerable, it's like the other person melts and they become more empathic towards you, and they start to see more of you. And so there's a fear of, underneath some of that might be a fear, if I show you more of me, you'll reject me, which isn't true. But that's might be like around one of your core wounds. But if I show you more of me, you might leave me. So you have to work against that core wound and say, no, I can show this person more and more in me as the relationship develops. And that's how healthy intimacy gets developed. And if they're a safe person, it's not like we go on a first date and we share everything. We're not super vulnerable. But as it progresses, we get more and more vulnerable, and we show more and more parts of ourselves, even the parts that we think are undesirable come up, and the other person can receive them, and vice
Mhm.
versa.
Mhm.
Does that answer that for you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and in my experience too, it is another positive feedback loop where the more comfortable I get with being vulnerable, the less it feels like I'm taking off my armor, and the more it becomes a strength because
Absolutely.
you get more comfortable with. I've gotten more comfortable in my life with that the people who are gonna love me are gonna love me, and the ones who don't, whether they're toxic or not, that's just not where my energy is gonna go.
If
And
your if your partner can say what I hear you saying and repeat what you hear, like if I hear you
mhm.
saying that you struggle with being vulnerable, did I get that? And you say yes, you might even spill more. And then they can
Right.
say, I hear
Right.
you are scared, right? And so if they can mirror, we call it mirroring in couples counseling. If she can mirror you really well, it will open you'll see her really seeing you in a safe way. It will open
Oh, yeah.
maybe more for you, for even more to come out. And
Yeah.
I don't know, but I'm gonna guess because this happens a lot with men, but like sometimes you need to be vulnerable when you feel ready, not when you feel pressured. So like it's
Oh,
about
yes.
knowing when. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I've become so much more comfortable in my life of just defaulting to that. And in many ways, this last year, as hard as it was, raised the stakes and also pushed me to just be like, there's no emotional time. And in the middle of COVID, there was no emotional time or energy to be anything less than vulnerable because it was like, let's just get to the meat of it. I'm not.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And
So,
the bigger the fear, the harder the vulnerability might be. But yeah, I'll just
yeah.
add one more thing. I know we're running out of
Please
time.
do. Please do. Please do.
So our nervous systems can pick up when someone's safe. So if you have a safe partner, which sounds like you do, the more you can repeat it, the more your system will rewire to, this is a person I can be more vulnerable with. And the feedback loop is my nervous system is picking up on safety here. And the safer the person is. And that's why therapy kind of works when you really feel connected to the therapist, because it's safe and it can't be repeated. But when I'm really connected to a partner, the safer my nervous system can pick up on your nervous system, and I trust you, the more and more and more vulnerable the relationship
Mm.
usually then becomes. And so it's a process, and we can't fake it. Like I couldn't get on this screen today and fake feeling like comfortable with you. It's something our body just picks up on or not. So it's neuroception. That's like the technical word. But when we have a partner who's relatively safe and our body starts to sense that they're really safe, naturally more vulnerability will come out.
Yeah. It takes practice, right? It's
Yeah. Yeah. For on your side, it takes practice. On my side, it takes containment, letting the other person be more vulnerable.
Sure.
So
Right,
yeah,
right.
right. Yeah.
Uh, well,
Yeah.
we do have to wrap up just for time, but Jessica, I appreciate so much talking to you and just diving into all of this. Like I said, it's very dear to my heart that I think we all need more support in every way, shape, or form. And I appreciate so much everyone like you who's out there offering new solutions and new ways because every person needs their own version of it. And I think you never know what it might be where you find your kind of breakthrough or where you find the tools you need. So thank you
Totally.
for doing what you do, and it's been a pleasure talking. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you all soon.
Wait, I want to say one thing.
Yeah.
I want to
Oh,
just
please.
thank you. I want to thank you because you were actually really vulnerable today. And I'm sure everyone who's going to watch this video is going to appreciate my feedback, but they're also going to appreciate the fact that you were pretty open and vulnerable. So you made me feel really comfortable. And so I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, well, you made me feel very safe too. It's all
Okay, cool.
one person at a time. We're all getting more
Right.
vulnerable together.
Sounds good.
I love it. Well, we'll talk soon. Thank you
Okay,
so
thank you.
much, and have
All
a
right.
wonderful day.